Hello everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below if you enjoy bedtime stories filled with mystery and strange happenings. Your support keeps this channel alive and helps me bring you more haunting narratives every night. Now, settle down, dim the lights, and listen closely. This story is titled The Last Broadcast from WNKR Radio Station, Ohio. It was a cold night in the autumn of 1979, when the small-town radio station WNKR, located on the outskirts of Kenton, Ohio, transmitted what would later be known as its final live broadcast. The town itself was quiet that night, the streets empty except for a few late workers heading home, and the faint orange glow of lamps flickering over wet pavement after a brief drizzle. Inside the radio station, a young broadcaster named Daniel Harris sat behind the microphone. Daniel was 29 years old, tall and thin, with tired eyes that showed the strain of too many long shifts. He had been working at WNKR for nearly 5 years, mostly taking the late-night slot that few others wanted. That evening, he arrived at the station around 10:15 p.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and his worn-out leather satchel filled with vinyl records and handwritten notes. The station itself was nothing grand, just a brick building by the railway tracks with a rusted sign outside that read WNKR 103.7 FM. Your voice in the dark. Its reputation was modest, broadcasting music, local news, and community updates. But Daniel loved the quiet hours when his voice reached the lonely drivers on the highways, the insomniacs in their living rooms, and the occasional trucker pulling over for coffee. That night, however, something felt different. Daniel noticed it the moment he unlocked the door. The air inside the station was unusually cold, almost damp, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the rain. The faint hum of the equipment echoed oddly in the empty building. He shrugged it off, thinking the heating system was failing again, and began preparing for his midnight segment. By 11:45 p.m., the town outside had fallen into a deeper silence. The only sound in the station was the gentle crackle of the vinyl spinning on the turntable. Daniel leaned into the microphone and greeted his listeners with his usual warmth. Good evening, Kenton. This is Daniel Harris, keeping you company through the long hours. Tonight, I've got some blues records to play, and maybe a story or two if you're still awake. Stay with me. You're never really alone as long as the radio is on. His voice carried through the night, reaching farmhouses miles away, flickering radios in gas stations, and solitary bedrooms where the lonely found comfort in his presence. But at 12:17 a.m., everything changed. As he switched records, the broadcast was interrupted by a sudden burst of static. Not unusual for a small-town radio frequency, but this was louder, sharp enough to make Daniel wince. He tapped the console, adjusted the dials, and muttered into the mic. Apologies, folks. Seems we've got some interference tonight. The static faded, but then a voice came through. It wasn't his. It was faint, hollow, and distorted, like a whisper crawling through the wires. At first, Daniel thought it might be a bleed over from another station, but the words that followed froze him in his seat. Daniel there listening. He sat upright, his hand trembling over the microphone. Who is this? You're interfering with a live broadcast. The listeners that night reported later that the silence which followed was unbearable, as though the station had gone completely dead. Then, without warning, the voice returned, clearer than before. You can't leave, Daniel. Not tonight. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the only sound in the suffocating room. Daniel felt his chest tighten, his pulse racing. He pulled off his headphones and turned in his chair, scanning the dimly lit studio. The door to the recording booth stood slightly ajar, though he was certain he had closed it. Outside, the railway tracks shimmered faintly under the moonlight, and a distant whistle of a train echoed across the fields. He leaned back toward the microphone, his voice strained but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be having technical difficulties. Please stand by while The line cut into static again, followed by what sounded like faint laughter. Not the kind of laughter from a human throat, but something mechanical, broken, as though the wires themselves were trying to imitate a voice. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for the switchboard, but the equipment responded strangely. Lights flickered across the console that had never turned on before, and the needles on the gauges jumped violently. He pulled the main power lever down, but the machines refused to stop. The broadcast continued, even though the transmitter should have gone silent. And then, the voice spoke once more. "Stay with us, Daniel. Stay on the air. Forever." The cold in the room deepened, as though the walls themselves were breathing. The chill inside the studio grew unbearable. Daniel rubbed his arms, but no warmth came. His breath fogged slightly in the air, something that should not have happened in a heated building. He checked the small clock above the microphone again. 12:23 a.m. time seemed to drag slower than usual, as if each second stretched unnaturally long. Listeners across Kenton would later recall how the signal changed at that exact moment. Some described it as though the broadcast no longer came from a studio, but from a cavernous place far away. The acoustics were wrong, the echoes too deep, and Daniel's voice carried a weight of dread when he spoke again. "Folks, if you can hear me, I don't know what's happening here. Please know, I'm still at the station. I'm still on air. But something isn't right." His words trembled slightly, not like his usual calm tone. Those tuned in that night leaned closer to their radios, caught between curiosity and fear. The strange voice returned, layered with static. "We are here, Daniel. We've always been here." Daniel stood quickly, his chair scraping the floor. His first thought was a prank. Perhaps some local kids had hacked into the frequency, or maybe another station was bleeding onto the channel. But no, the way the words bent and echoed felt inhuman, not shaped by normal lungs. He left the booth for a moment and walked down the dim hallway that led to the transmitter room. The walls hummed faintly, as if electricity pulsed through more than just wires. His footsteps echoed louder than usual. The transmitter door was shut, but when he touched the handle, it was icy cold. Inside, the machine roared with life. Needles spun wildly, red lights flashed, and the usual steady hum was replaced by something resembling a low chant. Daniel's eyes widened. He had never seen the equipment behave like this, not even during storms. He stepped back, nearly tripping over a loose cable. The chanting grew clearer, rising through the static that somehow continued to play on the airwaves. It wasn't English. The syllables were drawn out, guttural, echoing from the metal casing of the transmitter itself. Daniel hurried back to the main studio, his heart pounding, and slammed the door shut behind him. The booth's glass pane rattled, as though something unseen pressed against it. He grabbed the microphone with both hands. "To anyone listening," he whispered, "if you hear this, call the sheriff. Something is wrong at WNKR." But no phone calls would ever reach the station that night. The lines had gone dead just after midnight. In the town of Kenton, people began to notice unusual things as the broadcast continued. A family living on the edge of the cornfields swore their radio glowed faintly blue as Daniel spoke. A trucker parked at a rest stop claimed his CB radio picked up the same transmission, though it was turned off. Even an elderly couple, who had not owned a working radio in years, said they heard Daniel's trembling voice echoing faintly through the walls of their farmhouse. Inside the station, Daniel tried once more to shut everything down. He cut the switches, pulled cables from their sockets, even yanked the microphone cord out, and yet his voice still went out over the air, as if the station no longer needed equipment to speak. The whispering voices grew louder now, overlapping one another, forming a chorus. They spoke his name again and again, their tones ranging from pleading to commanding. Daniel, don't leave us. Daniel, stay here. Daniel, forever. He pressed his palms over his ears, but the words still filled his skull. He staggered back against the wall, eyes darting around the booth. The shadows seemed deeper than before, as though figures were pressing forward from the dark corners. He thought he saw movement near the glass pane of the studio door, but when he turned sharply, nothing was there. The clock ticked to 12:44 a.m. Daniel's voice, weak but steady, came once more through the broadcast. If you're still awake out there, I want you to know, I didn't sign up for this. I'm just a man who likes music, who likes keeping you company at night. But there's something using this station. I can't stop it. Those who heard him swore there was crying in his words, though no tears ever fell on the recording. At precisely 1:03 a.m., the signal spiked. Radios across the county blasted a piercing tone, forcing many to rip the plugs from their walls. When the sound faded, a new voice filled the air. It was Daniel's voice, but it was wrong. Slower, heavier. Each syllable dragged as if spoken by something mimicking him. The words chilled the blood of anyone who heard them. This is WNKR. We broadcast to you from beyond the silence. Stay tuned. Stay with us forever. Some swore the voice was layered. Daniel's real voice beneath, muffled and screaming, while the distorted version spoke over him. Inside the booth, Daniel clawed at the microphone, desperate to wrestle back control. He shouted into the mic, his real voice raw. No, don't listen. It's not me. It's not me. But only the twisted version reached the airwaves. The walls began to shake, dust falling from the ceiling tiles. The light above him flickered violently, casting long shadows that writhed like living things. Daniel dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the chorus of voices returned. By 1:27 a.m., the broadcast changed once more. Instead of words, the station played a sound that terrified every listener. It was breathing, long, slow, ragged breaths, as though something enormous was inhaling right beside them. Radios across Ohio carried the same unearthly rhythm, filling homes, cars, and empty streets with that dreadful presence. People tried to turn their dials, switch to another frequency, but many discovered every station carried the same sound. It was WNKR, bleeding into the entire spectrum. In the booth, Daniel stared at the console in horror. Every channel light was on. Every signal bar glowed red. WNKR was everywhere, and so was whatever force had taken hold of it. He leaned close to the mic one last time, voice cracking. If someone ever finds this place, don't come inside. Please, just let it stay buried. The final sound caught on tape was the slam of the studio door. as though Daniel had fled down the hallway. After that, the broadcast ended in a sudden burst of static. Radios across Kenton went silent all at once. At dawn, residents noticed the station had stopped transmitting completely. Police were called, but when deputies entered the building, they found no sign of Daniel Harris. The studio lights were still on, the turntable still spinning a silent vinyl. But the microphone was cold, and the transmitter was dead. The only trace left behind was the tape reel that had recorded his shift. Investigators listened to it once, pale and shaken, then locked it away. Some say the reel was later destroyed. Others whisper it still sits in a dusty evidence box in the sheriff's office basement, waiting for someone reckless enough to play it again. As for WNKR, the station never broadcast again. The building was abandoned within the year. Locals claimed that those who tried to restart it complained of overwhelming headaches and voices whispering through the wires. By 1982, the brick structure had been boarded up, its rusted sign barely visible through weeds. Yet on rare nights, travelers passing the old railway tracks say their radios crackle with a faint signal, even if they've turned them off. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear a tired but familiar voice whispering through the static. This is Daniel Harris. You're not alone in the dark. The air falls silent after those words, but the feeling of being watched lingers long after. For years after that night in 1979, WNKR remained abandoned. The locals in Kenton treated the place with a strange mix of fear and reverence, as though it had become a tomb. Teenagers dared each other to break in, but most refused to go beyond the broken front door. A few who claimed to step inside swore they heard faint breathing in the walls, even though the air was still. By the late 1980s, the building had fallen into ruin. The sign out front rusted into near illegibility, the roof sagged, and the windows were covered in dust thick enough to blur the light of the setting sun. And yet, on certain nights, truck drivers still reported strange interruptions on their radios when they drove near the old railway tracks. In 1991, a British journalist named Oliver Grant first heard about the legend of WNKR during a visit to Cleveland. Grant was 34 at the time, a writer for a small magazine in London that focused on unexplained events. He had come to Ohio for a series on American ghost towns, but the story of a vanished radio host caught his attention immediately. He spent hours in the library, sifting through old newspapers from 1979, and pieced together the fragmented reports about Daniel Harris. What disturbed him most was the police note that mentioned the tape reel. The sheriff's office had never released its contents, yet multiple sources confirmed that deputies had listened to it before locking it away. One line in the report chilled him. Audio contains unnatural interference and potential psychological risk. Should not be broadcast again. Oliver was not the type to let warnings deter him. That autumn, he traveled to Kenton himself. The town was small, sleepy, and suspicious of outsiders. When he asked the locals about the station, most shook their heads and told him to forget it. An older man at a diner leaned close and whispered, "You don't want to mess with that place, son. People go in. They don't come out the same. Sometimes they don't come out at all." But curiosity outweighed fear. On a damp October evening, Oliver parked his rented car by the overgrown tracks and stood before the decaying shell of WNKR. The station loomed against the sky, its windows black and empty like sockets of a skull. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. He pushed open the door. It groaned loudly. the sound carrying through the deserted building. Inside, the reception desk was still intact, though covered in dust and old papers yellowed with age. The hallway stretched before him, dim and narrow, with peeling paint and sagging ceiling tiles. As he stepped deeper, the silence became unnerving. His own footsteps echoed too loudly. The rooms felt colder than the autumn air outside, though there was no sign of wind or open windows. Oliver's flashlight beam danced across faded posters on the wall, old broadcast schedules, and a rusted filing cabinet left ajar. When he reached the main studio, he froze. The microphone was still there. It stood in the center of the desk untouched, its black foam head covered in a thin film of dust. The turntable beside it was cracked, but one vinyl remained on the platter. He leaned closer and read the label under his beam. The song was a blues record, something Daniel Harris had likely intended to play that night. Oliver sat down carefully in the old chair. The leather was stiff, the cushion sunken. He imagined the broadcaster sitting here, his voice steady as the darkness closed in around him. He lifted his small cassette recorder and pressed the red button. "This is Oliver Grant," he whispered into his device, his accent clipped and precise. "It is October 12th, 1991, and I am inside the abandoned WNKR radio station in Kenton, Ohio. The microphone and console are still here, though long since broken. There is an atmosphere difficult to describe. Heavy, perhaps, as though the air itself has weight." He paused, listening. At first, there was nothing, but then faintly, the old console crackled. Oliver frowned. The station had no electricity. The power lines had been cut years ago. And yet, the dials flickered faintly, just enough to be noticed. He leaned closer, his breath caught in his throat. Then it came, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, curling through the dead wires. "Oliver." The journalist stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. His pulse thundered in his ears. He told himself it was imagination, the echo of his own voice bouncing through the empty studio. But deep down, he knew it was not. The voice was not his. It was older, heavier, weary. He gathered himself, pressed the recorder to his lips, and muttered shakily, I believe I heard a voice. It said my name." The microphone on the desk hissed softly, as though static still flowed through it. Oliver's beam quivered as his hand shook, illuminating the cracked glass pane of the booth door. For a split second, he thought he saw a shadow move across it, a tall, thin figure just outside. He rushed to the hallway, swung his light across the empty corridor. No one was there. The silence pressed harder, suffocating. He returned to the studio, heart pounding, and forced himself to stay calm. He needed proof. He needed something tangible to bring back to London. He set his recorder on the desk beside the microphone, left it running, and sat quietly in the dark. Minutes dragged on. Then, without warning, the tape reel on the console began to spin. Oliver froze. The machine had no power, and yet the reel turned slowly, grinding against old gears. A voice broke through, muffled, distorted, but agonizingly clear. "This is Daniel Harris. You're not alone in the dark." Oliver snatched his recorder, his hand trembling. The sound was identical to the last words reported by locals in 1979. He stuffed the device into his coat pocket and stumbled toward the exit, nearly tripping over loose wires. The hallway seemed longer than before. His footsteps echoed strangely, like two sets of steps instead of one. When he finally burst out into the damp night air, He gulped oxygen as if he had surfaced from drowning. The station loomed behind him, silent once more, its windows empty and watching. He didn't look back again. Back in London, months later, Oliver played the cassette for a small circle of colleagues. Most dismissed it as a clever trick, some form of audio manipulation. But one man, a sound engineer named Peter Hale, turned pale when he heard the voice. "That's not editing," he whispered. "That's something else. And listen carefully." They replayed the tape, volume high. Beneath Daniel's words, faint but distinct, another voice echoed. Not in English this time. Something older, guttural, chanting in rhythm with the breath of the recording. Oliver never returned to Ohio, but the story of WNKR followed him. At lectures, students asked about the tape, and he always refused to play it again. At night, alone in his flat, his radio sometimes crackled to life without being switched on. And in those moments, he swore he could hear breathing. By the mid-1990s, stories of the station spread beyond America. Paranormal researchers from Germany, France, and even Japan claimed to have studied the Kenton case. But it was the British who returned most often, as if drawn by something across the Atlantic. They wanted to know what had really happened on that autumn night in 1979, when a man named Daniel Harris disappeared into static and silence. And some whispered that Daniel was still broadcasting, trapped in the airwaves, waiting for someone reckless enough to tune in again. By the early 2000s, WNKR was little more than a ruin swallowed by weeds. The roof had caved in further, the windows broken, and graffiti scarred the brick walls. For locals in Kenton, it was nothing but a place of bad memory, a cautionary tale whispered to children. Yet far away, across the ocean in England, interest in the story only grew. A group of students at the University of York stumbled across Oliver Grant's old article while researching urban legends. They were fascinated by the detail of the last broadcast, by the mystery of the missing tape reel, and most of all, by the whispers about signals that still bled into radios decades later. The students decided to form a small research circle, calling themselves the Echo Project. In 2007, led by a postgraduate named Eleanor Reeves, the group traveled to Ohio. Eleanor was 26 at the time, with sharp eyes behind square glasses and a voice that carried authority despite her youth. She had a personal reason for her obsession. Her uncle had been a trucker in the late 70s and claimed he had been listening to WNKR on the night of the final broadcast. He died years later, but not before telling Eleanor about the strange voice that wasn't Daniel's. The Echo Project documented everything. They photographed the ruins, interviewed surviving locals, and searched archives in Columbus and Cleveland. What they found unsettled them. Hidden among routine police files was a reference to additional recordings made that night, copies stored by an unknown technician. Those files had vanished before investigators could secure them. During their stay in Kenton, Eleanor insisted on spending a night at the station itself. Against the advice of their guide, the students set up portable recorders and EMF devices inside the crumbling structure. At first, nothing happened. The night was quiet except for the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of freight trains. Then, at exactly 12:17 a.m., the same time Daniel Harris's broadcast had first been interrupted, their equipment spiked. The recorders captured a surge of static, and within it a voice. Not Daniel's. It was a woman's voice this time, faint and distorted. "You shouldn't be here." The students froze. Some wanted to leave immediately, but Eleanor urged them to stay. She whispered into her recorder, "This is Eleanor Reeves, University of York. We are documenting unusual activity at the WNKR site. October 14th, 2007. We have just captured a voice, female, warning us to leave." The devices hissed again, louder, as if responding. "We are still here," the voice said. One of the students, terrified, bolted out of the building. The others followed minutes later, shaken, leaving their equipment behind. In the morning, they retrieved it cautiously. On playback, they discovered something else. Beneath the voice, almost inaudible, there was breathing. The same slow, ragged rhythm reported by listeners in 1979. The Echo Project returned to England with hours of recordings. Most of the material was useless noise, but certain fragments chilled them to the bone. The breathing, the whispers, and one sequence at 1:03 a.m., when a male voice briefly emerged. "This is WNKR," it intoned. "Stay tuned. Stay with us." Eleanor listened a dozen times, convinced it was Daniel Harris's voice, distorted but recognizable. The findings spread through academic circles, then online forums. Paranormal communities debated endlessly whether the tapes were real. Some accused the students of fabricating the evidence, but others pointed out an unsettling detail. The interference on the recordings followed the exact same frequency bleed that had been documented in 1979. By the 2010s, WNKR had become an internet legend. Clips of the alleged broadcasts circulated on YouTube, often paired with static-filled visuals and eerie recreations of the studio. Some were fakes, obvious hoaxes made for entertainment. Yet a handful of recordings, traced back to the Echo Project, carried something different. A depth of sound, an echo that unsettled even skeptics. In 2016, a British podcaster named Jonathan Mercer decided to investigate further. Jonathan was known for his series on haunted locations across Europe, but he had never crossed into American territory until then. He contacted Eleanor, who by that time was a lecturer in folklore at York. She agreed to share the recordings with him under strict conditions. Jonathan listened in his flat in Manchester late one evening. The sound was faint at first, the usual static and tape hiss. Then came the voice whispering, "Daniel." Jonathan leaned closer to his headphones. The whisper grew louder. "Jonathan." He yanked the headset off, heart hammering. The recording should not have known his name. When he replayed the section, the tape said nothing more than Daniel. For weeks afterward, Jonathan's listeners reported strange interference during his podcast uploads. Episodes about unrelated topics carried faint background static. Some swore they heard breathing behind his narration. Others claimed a second voice occasionally overlapped with his, whispering phrases like "stay with us" or "don't turn it off." Jonathan eventually pulled the episode about WNKR from his channel, but by then it was too late. The internet had taken hold of the story. Dozens of amateur investigators flocked to Ohio, live streaming their explorations of the ruined station. Most captured nothing but dust and silence. A few, however, returned with footage of strange phenomena. Lights flickering without power, voices whispering from dead microphones, shadows moving across the broken glass panes. In 2021, a group of Kenton locals formed a petition to have the building demolished. They were tired of strangers trespassing and feared the old structure would collapse on someone. But before the demolition could be approved, a group of engineers surveying the site reported something unusual. Even without power, the building emitted a faint electromagnetic signal. Weak, but steady. The frequency, 103.7 FM, the same as WNKR's original broadcast. Word spread quickly, reigniting the legend. Some believed it was a natural anomaly, perhaps interference from distant towers. But others, especially in England, argued it was proof that the station was still transmitting after all these years, perhaps from somewhere not entirely within this world. By 2023, online communities were filled with people attempting to tune into the phantom frequency using software-defined radios. Most failed, but a handful claimed success. On certain nights, between midnight and 2 a.m. Ohio time, they reported hearing faint static, sometimes accompanied by breathing. And once, just once, a listener in Bristol swore he heard a man's voice break through the static. "This is Daniel Harris. You're not alone in the dark." The recording spread like wildfire. Analysts dissected it. Skeptics called it a hoax, and believers pointed out that the cadence of the voice matched perfectly with the surviving fragments from 1979. Eleanor, now in her 40s, listened with unease. She remembered that night in 2007, the female voice telling them to leave. She wondered who that voice belonged to. Had someone else been trapped in the station's frequency? Was Daniel still there, broadcasting into eternity, joined by others who had stumbled too close? No one knew for certain, but one fact unsettled her more than any other. The Bristol recording contained a second layer of sound. When enhanced, it revealed chanting, not in English, not in any language easily identified. The syllables matched the same guttural rhythm captured by Oliver Grant in 1991. And within those chants, if one listened closely, a new name emerged. Eleanor. She stopped listening after that. Yet late at night, when she sat alone in her flat, her radio sometimes clicked on by itself, always tuned to 103.7 FM, always filled with faint static. And sometimes, if she dared not move or breathe, she could hear the slow, ragged rhythm of something alive on the other side. It was then she finally understood what Daniel Harris must have felt on that night in 1979. The sense that once you heard the voices of WNKR, you were never truly alone again. Thank you, dear listeners of Shadow Storyteller, for staying with me until the very end of tonight's tale. The mystery of the last broadcast from WNKR radio station in Ohio may never have a clear explanation. Some say it was simply a technical failure. Others believe it was the echo of something far older, something that does not belong to our world. Whatever you choose to believe, the signal faded into silence, and with it, so did the voices that had once filled the night air. What lingers is the unsettling thought that perhaps, even now, a faint transmission drifts through the static, waiting for someone brave enough to tune in. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Join me again on Shadow Storyteller for more unsettling stories before bedtime. Until then, sleep well if you can.